Hi, I'm Ali Janes, in for Jamie Poisson. At the end of July, a UN expert published a statement denouncing the Israeli army's threats on the life of a young Palestinian man who was one of the few remaining journalists in northern Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists referred to these threats on his life as an effort to manufacture consent to kill him. His name was Al-Sharif, and he'd been reporting in the Gaza Strip, his home, since the start of this military campaign. He was one of Al-Jazeera's most prominent journalists there. On account of the threats to his life, our producer Matthew Amha had been talking with Anas about appearing on this podcast to talk about what it was like to be one of the most precarious working reporters in the world today. Late Sunday, Anas was killed in a targeted Israeli strike on a tent near a medical facility in Gaza City. He was killed alongside 3 members of his team. 7 people total were killed in the strike, including 2 other freelance journalists. Not long before his death, Anas uploaded a video on X of a series of nearby Israeli airstrikes. Anas's work kept him away from his wife, his 4-year-old daughter Sham, and his 1-year-old son Salah for long stretches of time. You might have seen the video of him reuniting with his daughter a few months before he was killed. His friends, as well as his employer, are referring to his killing as an assassination. Israel has publicly admitted to killing him. The IDF described Anas as a, quote, terrorist posing as a journalist for Al-Jazeera, alleging that he was the head of a Hamas terrorist cell. Anas, Al-Jazeera, and organizations like the UN have dismissed those accusations as baseless. This has been the deadliest conflict for journalists in recent history. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 192 journalists and media workers have been killed since the campaign in Gaza began. Al-Jazeera puts that number closer to 270. Today, we wanted to center the experiences, conditions, and ultimate cost of journalism in the Gaza Strip, and to center the work of Anas Al-Sharif himself, who declared that despite options to the contrary, he would never leave Gaza, no matter how dangerous his reporting became. Sharif Abdelkudus is the Middle East editor at Dropsite News and a longtime reporter on and in the region, and he joins us today. Hi, Sharif. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk to you today about Gaza journalist Anas Al-Sharif, Al Jazeera's 28-year-old star reporter, one of their few remaining journalists in northern Gaza. He was born in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp in 1996. And can you just, talk to me about Anas, what you knew about him, and your own reaction to the news of his killing?
Anas Al-Sharif had emerged as probably the most recognized Palestinian journalist that was still alive and reporting from Gaza. His face was known across the Arab world and really internationally from his continuous coverage over the past 22 months. He was a near constant presence on television and online. He reported and endured, this brutal onslaught on Gaza for nearly 2 years, reporting almost every day on airstrikes, on shelling, on massacres, on displacement, on famine, on death. And in many ways, I think a lot of people thought because of his stature and because of his prominence that he couldn't be killed, that Israel wouldn't dare. And nevertheless, he was killed. And I think it's important to remember this was a massacre of 6 journalists. Anas is by far the most well known, and he's the one that Israel said targeted in its assassination of him. But this strike on Sunday in a media tent outside of Shifa Hospital in Gaza City killed 6 journalists. I think their names are important: Mohammed Qareqa, Ibrahim Zahir, Mu'min Alewa, and Mohammed Nufal, and another journalist from the media outlet Sahat, Mohammed Al-Khalidi. And Anas was threatened directly by the Israeli military from the very beginning of the war. So in back in November of 2023, he was receiving calls from Israeli military officers on his phone telling him to cease coverage, telling him to leave the north. This was a period where hundreds of thousands were forcibly displaced from the north to the south under displacement orders by Israel. He was a handful. He was, one of a handful of journalists that remained in the north throughout. He would receive WhatsApp messages with location pins of his location from the Israeli military as a threat, letting them know they knew exactly where he was. He refused to stop his coverage. Um, they responded by bombing his house in Jabalia and killing his 90-year-old father. Nevertheless, he continued covering. And throughout all of this, he is seeing some of the most horrific violence of this century unfold before him. He's always on the scene reporting what's happening. He's burying his best friends, his journalist colleagues, people like Ismail El-Ghul, Hussam Shabet, and despite him being openly threatened by the Israeli military, um, Israel clearly felt that it could kill him without having any consequences for it. That they could do it with impunity because they had killed over 200 journalists before, and nothing really changed. There are some words of condemnation when they kill journalists, but that's about it. The weapons keep coming, the money keeps coming, the support keeps coming, and to be frank, the media coverage of the conflict—it's not even a conflict; it's been classified as a genocide. Um, and the media coverage of the killing of journalists helps enable this impunity to continue. And just as recently as 2 weeks ago, he did a report about the widening famine in Gaza, where he broke down on air. And the response by the Israeli military was to taunt him in a video by the Israeli military spokesperson and threaten him, and saying basically that they were going to get him. He wrote in a post online, and I'll quote from it. He said, "After I reported live on civilians collapsing from hunger, I was directly targeted with public incitement by the army's spokesperson. This is an attempt to silence us and to cover up a genocide unfolding in real time. I call on international officials, human rights defenders, and global media to speak out and share this message. Your voice can help stop the targeting of journalists and protect the truth." And he went on to characterize Israel's threats as silence or death. And he vowed not to be silent. And they killed him.
In some ways, Anas's young life kind of seems to chart the modern history of the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, at least over these past few decades. He was 3 years old when the Second Intifada started. He was 10 when the Israeli blockade began in Gaza. He was 17 during the 2014 Gaza war, 20 at the start of the Great March of Return protests in 2018, which, just briefly for our listeners, they were these weekly demonstrations near the Gaza-Israel border to demand an end to the blockade and the right of return for refugees. And of course, he's now dead at 28, following 2 years of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. And, this was really the story of his life. And so, given that life experience, what do you think it was that would have called someone like Anas to want to dedicate his life to telling the stories of those in Gaza?
I think he really believed in the power of journalism, in the power of the image, in the power of the word, in exposing what is happening from the target end of the gun. Um, he told me as much. I interviewed him in September, um, and he responded with kind of a 10-minute voice note on WhatsApp. Uh, and one of the questions I asked him was, "Why do you keep doing this?" And I'll quote to you what he said, because you're asking what drove him to become a journalist or to continue journalism. And this is what he said. It is the duty of the world to see and witness what we are documenting and what we are reporting. Maybe the world won't act. Maybe the world won't help us. But there might be a motive to stop this war. Every time I document a massacre or event or bombing, I think that maybe through this bombing or this image that the war could stop and this war could end. This drives us to continue in our coverage to our last breath. And he did just that. He continued to his last breath. He also had heroes to look up to. There are legends of reporters in Gaza who have covered all those wars previously that he grew up with. And there was recently a photo published of him as a young boy, I think during the 2008-2009 war, uh, as a journalist in a press flak jacket is talking and he's looking up at him. So, I think he really believed in the power of journalism when it is done correctly and when it does have the power to stop. But I don't think any of us quite imagined that journalists could be killed with such impunity for so long in this way.
He had written this statement to be published in the event of his death. This was posted on his social media pages about an hour after he died. And I just want to read a few excerpts of that statement. It said in part, "If these words reach you, know that Israel has succeeded in killing me and silencing my voice. Allah knows I gave every effort and all my strength to be a support and a voice for my people, ever since I opened my eyes to life in the alleys and streets of the Jabalia refugee camp. May Allah bear witness against those who stayed silent, those who accepted our killing, those who choked our breath, and whose hearts were unmoved by the scattered remains of our children and women, doing nothing to stop the massacre that our people have faced for more than a year and a half." Looking at his life, at the many tens of thousands, just like him, that have been killed, how do those words strike you today?
I mean, every time I read them or I hear them read, I'm on the verge of tears. This is a 28-year-old who knew he would most probably be killed because he was being openly threatened and because the world was doing nothing to protect him. And so he penned these words, and he's saying very important things. I mean, he also said in that letter, he reminds people, he said, I wish I could return with my family and loved ones to our original town of occupied Ascalon, which is Al-Majdal, reminding people that I think 75% of Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're refugees and they want to return to their homes. And yeah, to think that someone in their 20s is writing something knowing that they're going to be assassinated and that this should be read out, and that he's saying, I entrust you with Palestine. Don't look away. Don't forget Gaza. It's deeply moving. It's heart wrenching, and it's also a source of shame, I think, for all of us that this is being allowed to happen. And we can talk about this later, but the media coverage in many Western media institutions of Anis's killing and the 5 other journalists who died alongside him, I think has been shameful for the most part. And it is exactly that type of coverage that allows this wanton killing of journalists and the continued onslaught on Gaza to continue.
Yeah, I do want to get into that Western media coverage in a few moments here. Now, I'll mention first. I mean, we should mention the fact that the Israeli military had been referring to Anas as a member of Hamas's military wing for some time. So I just wanted to go through some of these allegations that the IDF has made and to get your take on them. Firstly, the IDF has alleged that Anas was the head of a Hamas terrorist cell that they say targeted Israeli civilians with rockets. They've posted some screenshots of some lines from electronic spreadsheets that they say are the lists of Hamas operatives and that include his name, but it's not clear like where these what these spreadsheets are, what the actual evidence is behind them. And I'll note that these allegations have been refuted by Al-Jazeera, also refuted by Anas himself, and they've been called baseless by journalism organizations. A UN expert also described them as a, quote, blatant attempt to endanger his life and silence his reporting. A couple other things. Firstly, the IDF's Arabic spokesperson recently published some photos of Anas with the late Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who's believed to have masterminded the October 7th attack. When you take all of this together, like, what are your takeaways? Like, what would you say about these allegations by the IDF?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but first of all, as you listed, there's one party claiming that he was a militant within Hamas. That's Israel, the party that killed him. International press watchdog groups like CPJ, UN experts, who are, we're talking about allegedly neutral observers, are disputing these claims and saying they're unsubstantiated. Okay? So that's one. A photo of him with Yahya Sinwar, so what? I can show you many photos of Israeli journalists standing alongside Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu, there's an arrest warrant for him by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Does that mean that it's legitimate to go kill those journalists that stood alongside him smiling? I mean, these things are preposterous, and when you flip them, just as I just did, and you put it in this other context, it's absurd. It's absurd what's being said, and also the allegations are coming from the Israeli military that has shown us time and time again that it lies, that it fabricates. They also accused Anas's friend, also an Al Jazeera journalist, Ismail al-Ghul, who they killed in an airstrike in July of 2024 that decapitated him. They accused him of being a Hamas militant, of getting a Hamas Qassam, which is the military wing of Hamas, of getting a Qassam military ranking in 2007. Ismail al-Ghul would have been 10 years old at the time. That's how absurd the claim is. They've put out documents after they killed Hamza al-Dahdouh, the son of Wael al-Dahdouh, who was Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief before he was injured and left Gaza. They killed Hamza al-Dahdouh in an airstrike in January 2024. After they killed him, first they said it was a mistake. Then they admitted to killing him and said he was in fact a militant with Islamic Jihad. And they put out this document that was so blatantly fabricated that was immediately refuted by the Committee to Protect Journalists. Where is the outrage? There should be outrage. And Western media outlets can show outrage. When Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, was wrongfully imprisoned by Russia, there was no checking of the charges against him, whether he was a spy. Let's independently verify. No. Immediately, all Western media institutions, in no uncertain terms, said this is a sham trial. These are fabricated charges, as they should be called out. When Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, was lured into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and killed, there was no, hemming and hawing over, whether he was a spy or endangering Saudi's national security, and let's look into these charges. Of course not, because they're absurd charges. But this way around, Israel is given all of this rope, and in the coverage of Anas's killing, it's reflected. Reuters in 2024 won a Pulitzer Prize for photography. It submitted several photos, I think 6 photos. One of those photo submissions is by Al-Sharif. It's a photo of the crater from a massive airstrike in Jabalia, a very powerful and horrific photo. He was part of their Pulitzer Prize winning submission. Reuters' headline of the killing of Al-Sharif was The headlines, Israel kills Al-Jazeera journalist it says was Hamas leader. And then it front loads in the lead Israel's claim. It then goes down later to eventually quote Jazeera's denial, CPJ's denial, the UN Special Rapporteur's denial. But it's putting it in a framework that is kind of like he said, she said. And I've said this before, but there's an old story about how to do journalism. If you're sitting in a room and two people are arguing about the weather, and one person is saying it's raining outside and the other person says it's not, the job of the journalist is not to print those two statements. The job of the journalist is to look out the window and then expose the one that's lying. And that's what's happening. This is not journalism, it's stenography. They're just printing both statements and allowing this killing to continue.
On that note, I mean, Western press obviously makes a lot about our pursuit of truth, our role in the democratic process. The Washington Post has this Democracy Dies in Darkness campaign. And that's always kind of the way that we like describe what we do, even when we fall short. But like, just to put a couple more headlines to you on top of that Reuters one, here in Canada, the National Post ran with a headline about his killing. IDF kills Hamas terror cell leader posing as Al Jazeera journalist. I'll note they've now updated it after a lot of backlash. Germany's Bild newspaper ran a headline reading, terrorist disguised as journalist killed in Gaza. Talk to me more. You've been talking about this quite a bit, but just talk to me more about what you make of the way that Western media has responded to the killing of our Palestinian colleagues throughout this whole military campaign.
I am still somehow shocked by it, even though I shouldn't be, because it's been almost 2 years. It's not only the killing of journalists in Gaza, it's the coverage of Gaza itself. The National Press Club in Washington, D.C., which is a very, august organization, said it was troubled and saddened by Al-Sharif's killing and called for a thorough and transparent examination of the circumstances surrounding his death. That means absolutely nothing. What investigation is needed? Israel has admitted to killing him. They admitted to bombing him. They've been threatening him for months. They won't even put a clear statement of condemnation. And at this point, condemnation is not enough because Israel clearly doesn't care about condemnation. There has to be some form of action. I don't know what that action should be. Maybe there should be a disclaimer every time the Israeli military is quoted. Maybe there should be some disclaimer saying that they have a policy of killing journalists in Gaza. The thing that troubles me is that most of these press organizations are not operating in hostile media environments. Like, where I'm from, Egypt, it's very difficult to do free reporting because there's heavy censorship and you can be imprisoned. They're not being forced to do this. So why are they doing it? And the only thing that I can sort of see is that for most of large corporate legacy media institutions, I'll talk about the United States, their span of kind of coverage spans the degree of debate in Washington, spans establishment orthodoxy. So if that debate is vigorous, you'll get kind of vigorous coverage of everything. So for example, if they're covering reproductive rights or gun rights or LGBTQ plus rights, these are things that there's a big span of debate in Washington. So the coverage reflects that. But there is a consensus in Washington, mostly, for the most part, it's changing slightly, but there is a consensus supporting Israel. And so the coverage reflects that also. I think, a lot of journalists in these institutions pride themselves on being quote unquote objective. They look down on a lot of independent media outlets saying that they're activist journalists. I'm not sure what that means, but I know they mean it as a slur, that they're somehow biased in their coverage. But I can't think of more bias that has like swallowed the establishment orthodoxy that they can't see it anymore. It's like what water is to fish. And the rhetorical acrobatics they have to do sometimes when they're reporting on Gaza uh, is absurd. Some of the headlines. There was one in the New York Times early on in the war that I saved because I couldn't believe it. They had bombed the Jabalia refugee camp and killed dozens of civilians. And the headline was Explosion Gazans say was airstrike kills many in Gazan neighborhood. I mean,
Huh.
the rhetorical gymnastics to come up with that when the headline is simply Israel bombs refugee camp in Gaza, killing dozens. So, I don't know why this continues. I honestly think they're losing a lot of credibility because of this coverage. There is anger against many large media outlets in the United States for this continued coverage, not just of the assassination of journalists, but of Gaza in general. There are protests outside the New York Times. I think people are turning away because it's so blatantly uh, in favor of one side and is such a double standard when you compare it to their coverage of other wars.
You reported extensively on the murder of Shireen Abuaklay. She was a Palestinian American journalist who worked for Al-Jazeera and one of the most prominent reporters in the Arab world. She was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper while reporting in the West Bank. The Israeli government initially claimed that she may have been killed by a Palestinian. And this eventually there was like a number of investigations, including forensic investigations, that showed that that was not the case. Your work was about the killing itself, but also about the denialism that followed. And I wanted to just put a quote to you that I saw today from Raed Faki, who manages Al Jazeera's Arabic language channel. He said that had Israel been held accountable for Shireen's assassination, it would not have dared to kill 200 journalists in Gaza.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point by bringing up Shireen Abuaklay. She was um, extremely, much more than Anas Sharif, a well-known, prominent, famous journalist on in the Arab world. Um, she had been covering Palestine since she started working at Jazeera in the 90s, but she started covering really the Second Intifada since 2000. People knew her. So if someone like that and she was killed in broad daylight, wearing her full press gear, her flak jacket, helmet, with press emblazoned across the front of the flak jacket, walking slowly up a street in Jenin. There were no clashes in the area at the time. Her killing is caught on video. There's eyewitnesses everywhere. And still, no one is held to account. She also had American citizenship, and so the US government is supposed to advocate for justice for her. And they didn't do that either. And as you mentioned, it's a good example of how Israel lies. In the beginning, they put out a video claiming that a Palestinian gunman killed her, like an errant bullet. This was very easily debunked, first by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and then by multiple media organizations. Then, under a lot of pressure, because there were a lot of investigations showing that the bullet most likely came from an Israeli soldier, a sniper, they finally admitted that they likely killed her, but that it was a mistake and that she was caught in crossfire. That claim of crossfire contradicts video evidence and eyewitness testimony. And yet the US government adopted that narrative in its final report. And so no one was held accountable. And yes, I think that if someone of that stature, with such clear evidence that she was targeted, can be killed without any accountability or consequences, that certainly paved the way for this mass slaughter of journalists in Gaza. And in that case, there was kind of relatively good coverage, I think, by Western media institutions of her killing. CNN did a good investigation, the Associated Press, the New York Times, then the UN did one in forensic architecture. But the US government didn't. And, the Biden administration at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Biden mentioned Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was imprisoned by Russia. He mentioned Austin Tice, the American journalist who has been disappeared in Syria for many years. He didn't mention Shireen Abuaklay. He met with the parents of both of those journalists. He didn't meet with the family of Shireen Abuaklay. Why? She's also an American citizen. She Because she was killed by an ally. That's the only reason one can think. So yeah, I think Shireen is not forgotten by any means, and the impunity with which Israel is allowed to act just fuels their ability to continue this kind of impunity and slaughter.
The conditions and the outcomes of certain conflicts can kind of create the conditions for the next one. And I'm wondering how you think we might see what's happening in Gaza spill out into future wars or inform future campaigns of violence.
This killing of journalists in Gaza is not just a danger to Palestinian journalists or even Arab journalists. It's a danger to journalists everywhere across the world. The next time a military openly targets a journalist in another conflict, how can anyone point the finger at them? If Russia decides to kill a journalist or Germany decides to kill a journalist in some conflict, you can't say anything because Israel was allowed to do this. So I think it's has set such a dangerous precedent that will reverberate for a very long time. I don't think we're going to know what the effect is. Um, the level of destruction in Gaza, the complete destruction of Palestinian society in Gaza, the repeated targeting of hospitals, the repeated targeting of schools, the blowing up of every single university. So when you have these things allowed to continue to happen and backed by the most powerful country in the world, powerful countries, it's backed by the United States. It's also backed by Europe. There's more rhetoric coming out of Europe, but there's very little change in policy. They still sell and buy weapons with Israel. They're still Israel's biggest trading partner. So if there's no actual consequences, it'll be allowed to continue. And many people speak of how this marks the end of the post-World War II liberal international order, the order of human rights and international kind of the United Nations, this whole system that was built after World War II to prevent things like genocide from happening. The system was not perfect. It has been chipped away for many years. It often served the powerful, especially after 9/11. We saw the United States open Guantanamo Bay, conduct torture, invade countries without consequence. I don't think anyone, uh, people aren't naive. They realize it wasn't a perfect system. But it has been so completely blown apart now by this unfolding genocide that is not being stopped and is being actively supported that, yeah, who knows what's coming next. As the head of Amnesty International told me in an interview, they have opened the doors to hell.
All right, Sharif, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
All right, that is all for today. I'm Allie Janes. Thanks so much for listening to Front Burner, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.